When Jonathan found a very weak-looking black puppy in the forest, his first instinct was to bring it to a local vet to help it out. But he would soon realize that this was a big mistake. He was not dealing with a puppy at all and should have just left it right where he found it. But it was too late for that now. The reaction from the vet had made Jonathan even more sure about his suspicions. He had not rescued a puppy from the forest. This was something very different, and he was about to get the confirmation he was looking for. The vet came back out of the office, but he did not have the little black creature with him. He looked concerned when he put a hand on Jonathan's shoulder and told him, "I know it's not your fault, but you made a big mistake." But what kind of animal did Jonathan rescue from the forest? And why would it have been better if he had just left it there alone? But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe, and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. Jonathan has been an animal lover for as long as he can remember. Today wouldn't be the first time he was on a rescue mission for an animal in need. He loved nature and would often walk through the woods, and like so many other times, today was a day he'd be a helper to an animal in need. But things aren't what they seem. Jonathan thought he'd seen it all. After all, he'd rescued dozens of animals from birds to rodents, lost dogs and cats, and something resembling a wild boar. He didn't like to be called a hero, but deep down it felt good to help these animals. After all, they were so cute and lovable. How could he refuse to help an animal in need? He was pretty skilled at helping animals. He could identify basic problems and knew a few vets in the city. This also meant he felt pretty confident in his skills at identifying animals, but this time would be different. The most important problem at hand was the baby animal all alone, but the trouble would start soon. While on one of Jonathan's walks through the woods outside of the city, he was sure he heard an animal crying for help. He paused in the woods waiting to hear it again. It was only a few seconds until he heard the cry again. It was faint, but it was there, and most of all, it sounded like a puppy. But how did a puppy get way out here? Jonathan was determined to find the lost puppy. Listening to the cries and taking careful, soft steps, he made his way through the forest. He thought he'd lost the puppy at one point when the crying stopped. Frightened he'd gone too far, Jonathan took a few steps back until he once again heard the soft crying. It was then that he spotted the little thing. There was a small bed of moss, and laying on top of it was a little black puppy, so young that its eyes hadn't fully opened yet. Jonathan leaned over the poor creature and looked around for other possible puppies. After all, they usually came in bunches, but there was nothing. Jonathan spent a few minutes looking over the little creature, trying to see if it had any wounds of any kind. The puppy seemed fine, except for being alone and probably scared. But was it a puppy? The more he looked at it, Jonathan wasn't sure. And that wasn't the only odd thing here. The little moss bed that held the supposed puppy was strange and looked odd to Jonathan. This wasn't something very likely to be found in nature. Perhaps some animal had built it as a sort of nest. But still, an animal would be messier. This left one very confusing and possibly terrifying conclusion. If it hadn't been an animal and it wasn't natural, that left one possibility: humans. The big question was, why would someone come out to the middle of the woods and leave a baby puppy all alone? And was it even a puppy? Jonathan had a lot of questions and no answers, but he knew one thing had to be done. Making a makeshift carrier for the tiny animal out of the cover of his travel bag, he carefully put the puppy inside it. He still had a lot of walking left to go before he'd reach his car, but at least for now, the little thing would be safe and protected from any nasty animals around. Jonathan repeatedly checked on the puppy as he walked back to his car. It was threatening to rain, and Jonathan didn't want the little baby to get wet or a chill, but the more he looked at the animal, the more curious he got. While he had suspicions of it not being a puppy, he was almost sure now. The black creature was small and definitely a baby, so it didn't have any distinctive features. It was really too young to tell what it was, but the face looked odd enough. It'd have to be some kind of crossbreed for it to have a face like that. He couldn't think of any other explanation. It wasn't until further on his walk that Jonathan had another idea. Maybe the animal wasn't native to this forest or area. A puppy wouldn't be native to around here, but at least it would make a bit more sense. If the animal wasn't native to this area, how'd it get here? Again, the only plausible answer was humans. It didn't really matter what the creature was, Jonathan was going to look after it and get it the help it needed. A shelter would probably take the puppy, but it needed to be seen by a vet first. The city was a half-hour's drive away. Jonathan hoped the creature would be okay until then. It was getting darker out. After another few minutes, Jonathan finally reached the parking lot. It didn't take him longer than 2 seconds to figure out something was very, very wrong. The parking lot was completely empty. There wasn't anyone there. That would be normal with the rain coming in. But his car was missing too. Recovering himself, Jonathan walked over to where he was sure he parked it. Thinking he could be wrong, he took a quick walk around the lot and searched for his car. It couldn't have been towed. He'd parked it right here in this lot. That was perfectly legal. He went back to the first spot and found a single clue. Bending down to the pavement, Jonathan found a lot of broken glass. Small fragments that he had missed earlier. It was evident now that someone had broken into his car and stolen it. They'd had both the time and opportunity. How was he supposed to get back to the city now and with rain rolling in? The park where he'd been walking wasn't well known and was off of a fairly quiet road. Lucky for him, Jonathan still has his phone and some battery. He decided to call the police first to report his car being stolen. The baby animal in his pack was important, but right now his car took priority. Jonathan told the police what kind of car he had, the make, the model, where it had been, the license plate, and anything else he thought was important. The police told him they'd keep an eye out for it, but that was all they could do for now. He thanked them and hung up. That was done, but he was still stranded. He thought about getting to his apartment in the city, but the little creature in his pack still needed attention. He needed to get to the vet's first and then go home. Unfortunately, the vet's office was in the city, still a half hour away, and now he didn't even have a car. But in today's world, it couldn't be that hard to get a ride, right? Jonathan checked the Uber app first. No one was willing to drive that far out of the city to come and pick him up. Jonathan was willing to pay the price for a ride, but no one was interested. Jonathan tried a taxi service next. He explained his situation, but they told him no too. They were worried it was a scam to rob them and their drivers. This didn't stop Jonathan yet. In a city that big, there were several taxi companies, but he lost hope as service after service turned him down. Jonathan was furious after the sixth company refused him. He was desperate and it was starting to sprinkle rain now. He didn't want to stay in the cold. It was time for something drastic. He was going to hitchhike. While there weren't many cars that came down this road, one would have to come eventually. It was just a matter of time. Thankfully for him, he only had to wait about 10 minutes before a car came turning around the bend. Jonathan thanked his lucky stars and went to work. Jonathan flagged down the car, and once he had their attention, put out his thumb, showing he needed a ride. A middle-aged woman rolled down the window of her car. Jonathan explained what had happened to him, that his car had been stolen and he needed a ride into the city. Would she believe him? As luck would have it, she was indeed heading to the city as well and had no problem picking up Jonathan to go with her. She seemed kind enough and believed his story. He sat down in the passenger seat, and from the moment he sat down, he heard a curious noise coming from the back seat of the car. Jonathan sat up, his mind on the animal that was cradled in his arms. Next to him, the woman's Labrador approached the bundle, slowly sniffing around it to figure out what was hidden inside. At first, Jonathan thought the dog had smelled a puppy, and its motherly instinct had kicked in, but he quickly realized how wrong he was. Jonathan smiled at the bigger dog, loosening his grip on the bundle covering the puppy. As the Labrador approached, Jonathan revealed the small creature, but things quickly took a turn for the worse. The Labrador growled aggressively, forcing its owner to intervene. Jonathan's heart sank as he realized the animal he found in the forest was not a puppy. Determined to identify the creature, Jonathan decided to visit a vet. After arriving, the receptionist, alarmed by the animal's condition, prioritized Jonathan. Soon, the vet examined the small bundle. Jonathan recounted the forest incident while the vet took notes. After a brief discussion, Jonathan returned to the waiting room, leaving the animal in the vet's care. While waiting, Jonathan took the opportunity to report his stolen car. To his surprise, the police had already recovered it, as a thief had been caught driving the vehicle. Relieved, Jonathan hung up, only to be interrupted by the vet with a grave expression. The vet informed Jonathan that the animal, a baby raccoon, was critically ill with a highly contagious virus deadly to small mammals. Although humans were immune, strict protocols were necessary to prevent the virus from spreading. Both Jonathan and the staff had to disinfect and change clothes, while the raccoon was quarantined. Hours later, tests confirmed that none of the clinic's animals were infected. Unfortunately, the baby raccoon's condition worsened, and it passed away shortly after. The strange and eventful day left Jonathan reflecting on his decision to help the animal. In hindsight, leaving the raccoon in the forest might have been wiser, but Jonathan found solace in knowing he had tried to save it. Helping others, no matter the outcome, defined him, and he remained proud of his choice.